In Texas, some of the 30 million people I have the honor of representing, but they asked me, why aren't they seeing more solutions offered by the United States Congress to the problems that they confront in their everyday lives? Family budgets are being clobbered by inflation. People are spending significantly more money just to get by on housing, groceries, utilities, and other basic expenses. Inflation has remained at 5% or higher for each of the last 22 months. Of course, we've seen it soar to the highest level in 40 years. But it consistently outpaces wage growth, giving the average worker a pay cut. And folks, too many of them feel like they just can't catch a break. As if that wasn't a big enough financial headache, some are now questioning the stability of the U.S. banking system. In the last 2 weeks, 2 U.S. banks, big banks, have collapsed. And a group of major banks has now launched a rescue mission to save another from meeting the same fate. Texans are wondering, are these isolated events or the sign of worse things to come? The memories of the 2008 financial crisis are fresh in many people's minds, and they're terrified that we'll soon find ourselves in familiar territory. But families aren't just stressing about their finances, they're also worried about their safety. The surge in violent crime that began in 2020 hasn't let up. In many places, it's getting worse. And given the wave of fentanyl overdoses, especially among teens, parents are terrified that their child could become the next victim. They are outraged that fentanyl and illegal drugs are flowing across the southern border, and they want to know why more isn't being done to stop it. Of course, folks in Texas and across the country aren't just worried about the illegal drugs that came across the border and took the lives of 108,000 Americans last year. That's bad enough. They're also worried about the flood of unchecked migration across the border. Over the last couple of years, the Biden administration has broken nearly every record in the books when it comes to border crossings. We've seen a complete breakdown of law and order as thousands of migrants cross the southern border each and every day. And yes, my constituents are baffled when they read news stories that say that some of the migrants will have to wait 10 years before they can even begin immigration court proceedings. So with all of these problems, folks are trying to understand, how did we get here? But more importantly, they want to know, what are our leaders doing about it? Across the country, each and every day, our constituents are asking for answers, and they want to see some action. Every day, I get phone calls from folks back home or people who write to me about these problems, whether it's inflation or crime or drugs or the border crisis or one of many other topics. They ask me, when will the United States Senate take action? And unfortunately, I can't offer them much reassurance based upon the Democratic-led Senate's track record so far this Congress. Make no doubt about it, the majority gets to control the agenda here in the Senate, whether it's at the committee level or here on the floor. And as a member of the minority, there's not anything I can do under the Senate rules to force the majority leader to take action on a particular topic or to insist that a chairman of a committee that has jurisdiction to actually mark up legislation or hold hearings. So clearly, Democrats control the Senate. Their leadership continues to put all of these important and pressing issues on the back burner. Just look at what the Senate has done, or rather, look at what it has not done since the beginning of this year. Well, the Senate confirmed several federal judges and a handful of other nominees in the last 4 weeks. We overturned a dangerous D.C. crime bill, which would have softened penalties for criminals and endangered the lives of residents and visitors to our nation's capital. We nullified a Department of Labor rule that encouraged fiduciaries to support woke policies at the expense of Americans' retirement accounts and pensions. That's the end of the list. Those are the only items the Democratic-controlled Senate has passed in the last 4 weeks. Nothing to address the border crisis, nothing to combat inflation, nothing to stem violence, nothing to deal with the drugs that are taking the lives of our sons and daughters all across America. Now, the irony is the two resolutions that did pass were Republican priorities. These weren't even things that our Democratic colleagues initiated. We were able, under the Senate rules, to force action, fortunately, on those. But we've seen, in one case, the president's already vetoed one of those congressional review actions. Senator Hagerty from Tennessee led the effort to overturn the dangerous D.C. crime bill. Senator Braun from Indiana pushed to stop the administration from gambling away Americans' retirement savings. If you look at every vote the Senate's taken since the start of this Congress, you won't find much more. Lots of nominations, a resolution designating January as National Trafficking and Modern Slavery Prevention Month, which rightfully passed unanimously, but that's about it. That's what the American people have gotten from this Democratic majority in the Senate. Now, to be fair, it appears the Senate will soon vote on a bill to repeal the authorization for use of military force in Iraq. We took that procedural vote on this legislation last Thursday, which marked the first time this chamber voted to even consider a standard piece of legislation in this Congress. The first time. We voted on many nominations and a few resolutions, but that was the first true piece of legislation. So it took 2.5 months for our Democratic colleagues to put a bill on the floor. 2.5 months. At the start of the 116th Congress, Republicans held the majority in the Senate. Members were sworn in on January 3rd, a Thursday. The following Tuesday, the Senate voted on a bill related to U.S. policy in the Middle East. Sworn in on Thursday. Tuesday, we were voting on substantive legislation. That's what leadership looks like. Identify your priorities, hold hearings, build consensus, put bills on the floor, and let members do what they came here to do, which is to legislate, which is to address the priorities of the American people, which are being ignored by this Democrat-led Senate. So when voters put your party in charge, you're expected to lead. But that's not what we're seeing. As we witnessed the past 2 years, our friends across the aisle haven't used their majority to address the problems facing American families. They've simply been missing in action. While inflation, crime, and the border crisis are raging, our Democratic colleagues who control the Senate agenda and the House and the White House for the last 2 years had the power to pass just about any bill they wanted to address these priorities of the American people. But here's what the American people got instead. $2.6 trillion in partisan spending bills, tax increases, handouts for labor unions, subsidies for wealthy people to buy electric vehicles, and nothing to address the concerns of working families. Now that Republicans hold the majority in the House, the era of one-party rule has come to an end, which is, frankly, great news. This new chapter of divided government requires Republicans and Democrats to work together. Unfortunately, we can't make any progress in the Senate or in the Congress unless the majority leader allows us to take up, amend, and to vote on legislation. Legislation that addresses the priorities of our constituents, the people we represent. So I hope this sluggish pace, this snail's pace, will change. At some point in the coming months, Congress will need to address the debt ceiling. Given the current status of inflation and the instability of the banking system, defaulting on our debts is the last thing we need to do. Given the current state of our fiscal house, it's also critical that we pass regular appropriations bills on time and through regular order in a transparent, open manner, unlike the bill the majority leader put on the floor last December, an omnibus appropriation bill, which was the only way to fund the federal government because he would not allow the Senate to do its work in a transparent and orderly sort of way. And so members of the Senate had two choices: vote yes or vote no and shut down the government. We also need to pass an annual defense authorization bill, something we've done for more than the last 60 years in each year, to make sure that our military leaders have the certainty they need to address the threats of today and prepare for the threats of tomorrow. I don't recall a more dangerous time for our country and for the world than we currently are living in. Certainly not in my time at the Senate. Probably not since World War II, where you have a major power, the Russian Federation, invade a sovereign neighbor, as the Russians did in Ukraine. You have North Korea shooting off long-range missiles with nuclear weapons capability. You have Iran seeking to build a bomb. And then you have China threatening to invade a neighbor in Taiwan. So we need to pass that defense authorization bill. The Federal Aviation Administration needs to be reauthorized by the end of September, hopefully addressing some of the near misses we've seen in some of the air traffic recently. And my friend Senator Cruz from Texas is leading these efforts on our side of the aisle. We also need to reauthorize the tools that we need, namely Section 02 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, to know what our enemies are doing and to prepare for those and to deploy countermeasures. We need to take action to address the humanitarian and security crisis at the southern border, to bring down drug prices for consumers, and to unleash the power of American energy. We've seen what happens when Europe was dependent almost entirely on Russian oil and gas. And then when Putin weaponized that dependency, what that meant to the countries of Europe is they scrambled for alternative sources of energy. The United States, as an energy producer, is part of the answer to that energy security problem. But we can't solve that problem. We can't continue to provide good, well-paying jobs for people who work in that industry unless the government's willing to get out of the way and take its boot off the neck of the producers. So, Mr. President, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I know the presiding officer wants to be part of that solution. But we need more people in this chamber, in this city, in this country who want to be part of solving these problems. But we can't do it until the majority leader that controls the Senate is willing to put bills on the floor that actually address the priorities and concerns of the people we represent. I hope he will give us that chance. I yield the floor, and I'd note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.